Imagine for a moment a world without names, without stories, without the echo of a single word. The night stretches endlessly, heavy with silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through tall grass and the distant call of something wild. Above, the stars burn like patient eyes, watching, waiting. This is where our story begins. Not in the glory of cities, not in the roar of machines, but in the fragile stillness of a world before fire, before memory, before us. And here, dear listener, as we trace the delicate footsteps of our ancestors, I invite you to walk with me, to pause in this quiet moment, to lean into the slow unfolding of the human journey. If you find yourself drawn into this story, into the gentle rhythm of time's whisper, I ask you kindly subscribe to the Whispering Cosmos. Let this place be your fire in the night, your soft voice in the dark, your reminder that we are part of something vast, yet deeply human. Now, let us step back into the shadows of the beginning. There was no language to capture thought, no symbols to carry meaning, only breath and heartbeat, hunger and fear, the rustle of grass, hiding unseen danger. Early humans, or what would one day become humans, moved slowly across the savannas of Africa. Their bones were fragile, their bodies small compared to the predators that hunted the same plains. Yet in their eyes flickered something no claw or fang could extinguish. Curiosity. They bent low to study a stone, feeling its cool weight in their palms. They tilted their heads to the sky, gazing at constellations they could not yet name. They followed the river's winding path, not only because it gave them water, but because it seemed to whisper, "This way." This way. It was here that the first whispers of humanity stirred, not loud, not certain, but quiet as the pulse of the earth. Somewhere in the long stretch of time, a hand lifted a stone and struck it against another. Sparks leaped out, tiny suns born from the bones of the earth. The sound rang like a bell in the still air, startling birds from the trees. In that moment, something began. The fire did not roar yet. The flames did not climb high, but the idea of fire was born, even before flame itself. The imagination of possibility. For what is evolution, if not a slow unfolding of possibility? A dream carried forward, reshaped again and again by time's patient hand. The wind carried scents of rain, of grass, of death. The night pressed close. Early humans huddled together, not knowing why being near each other made the darkness feel lighter. They could not speak the words for safety or love or belonging. But still, they reached out, touching shoulders, brushing arms, leaning against one another as shadows closed in. Perhaps this was the first human language, not words, but warmth. Yet survival was never promised. Each dawn could be the last. The great cats prowled, the storms came, the hunger gnawed, and still fragile figures stood and walked day after day across endless plains. If you close your eyes now, you might hear them, the crunch of dry earth beneath their feet, the trembling of grass in the wind, the sharp cry of an eagle circling overhead. You might see their eyes, wide with alertness, searching the horizon for both danger and hope. They did not yet know what they were becoming. They did not yet know they were the beginning of us. And still, something stirred. The stars stretched overhead, vast and unreachable. The moon traced its patient path, and in the silence of those nights, Perhaps our ancestors lifted their gaze and felt the first tug of wonder, the first question forming without words. What are we? Why are we here? Every spark from stone, every shared glance, every step across that grassland was a note in a symphony still unfolding. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, humanity was beginning to whisper itself into being. But whispers can grow louder. Sparks can catch fire. And ideas, once born, refuse to die. One night, as lightning split the sky, fire spilled from heaven to earth. Branches crackled, animals scattered, and flames danced across the savannah. The early humans did not run this time. They circled close, fear and awe mingling in their pounding hearts. Heat pressed against their skin, shadows leaped across their faces. They reached forward, trembling, stretching out hands toward this living light. And in that moment, fear turned to fascination. The fire would become their companion, their guardian, their teacher. But fire is never only one thing. It warms, but it burns. It protects, but it consumes. And once held, it can never truly be forgotten. Whisper of humanity had found its first voice, and yet this was only the beginning. The fire was more than survival. It was more than light in the dark. It was a mirror, showing us something hidden within ourselves. For in its flicker, our ancestors began to see not just the world, but their own reflection, fragile, mortal, yet filled with unquenchable curiosity. The flames rose higher, smoke curling into the star-stained sky. Shadows danced on cave walls, stretched and bent by the light. Perhaps in those shadows, the first stories were born. Shapes twisting into figures, movements hinting at tales of the hunt, of danger, of mystery. It was here beside the fire, beneath the stars, that the human journey took its first true step. But as with every gift, there was a cost. Fire would change everything, how we lived, how we fought, how we dreamed. It would shape not only our bodies, but our very minds. And, in its light, the world itself would never look the same again. The fire had spoken, and now the whisper had become a voice. The fire still flickered in their memories, but daylight demanded something harsher. The savannah was not gentle. It stretched endlessly, an ocean of gold and shadow, where life and death played their eternal game. Each blade of grass was a hiding place. Each rustle carried a question, predator or prey. Our ancestors moved slowly here, their footprints pressed into soil that had carried countless creatures before them. They were not the strongest, not the fastest, not even the most fearsome, but within their fragile frames pulsed something invisible in instinct, a patience, a whisper of thought that set them apart. They were watchers, eyes scanning the tall grass, ears alert to the slightest shift in the wind. Every moment was suspense. Hunger gnawed, but fear pressed harder. The lions crouched unseen. The leopards clung to branches above, and beyond the horizon, storms gathered like clenched fists, ready to strike without mercy. The grasslands were a theater of shadows. Imagine it, a group of early humans, lean and cautious, moving in silence. Their skin glistens beneath the sun. Their breaths come sharp and shallow. They are armed only with sharpened sticks and stones carried close to trembling hands. A child clings to its mother's side, eyes wide with questions no language can yet ask, and all around them, the air hums with tension. Every shadow could leap, every moment could end. Yet even in this, something new was stirring. For the grasslands were not only danger, they were also opportunity. The wide horizon meant vision. The open fields meant paths. And in those endless paths, humanity found not only fear, but freedom. They learned to move together, to watch one another's backs, to sense the rhythm of predators and prey. When antelope darted in the distance, their eyes followed not only the animals, but the patterns of their run. When vultures circled above, they understood it meant death was near, and with death came food. If one dared approach, the savannah tested them, but the savannah also taught them. It was not a gentle teacher. It did not explain with words, only with survival. The lesson was clear. To live, you must notice what others do not. To endure, you must carry courage into every uncertain step. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, shadows grew long across the plains. The humans huddled near a cluster of trees, stomachs hollow, bodies trembling with exhaustion. The air grew heavy. Something moved in the grass. A lion. Golden eyes flashed, low and unblinking. Muscles rippled beneath its hide. The promise of death coiled in silence. The group froze, every instinct screaming to run, yet every step held by fear. The lion crept closer. The child whimpered, and then something happened. One of the hunters, thin and scarred, lifted his stone-tipped spear and shouted a sound raw and jagged tore from his throat. Not a word, not language, but defiance. Others joined him, voices rising in unison. Their bodies trembled, but together. Their noise was thunder. The lion hesitated. Shadows of flame flickered in their minds. Courage carried from the firelight into the open plain. For the first time, fear bent beneath will. The lion snarled, circled once, and slipped back into the grass, melting into silence. That night, as the stars blossomed above them, the humans sat not in silence, but in something different. They looked at one another, and though no words existed, something passed between them, a recognition, a bond. They were not only prey, they were becoming something more. Still, the grasslands did not let them rest long. The hunger pressed harder. Their bodies ached with need. Each day they woke to another battle, another chase, another shadow that might be death. And yet, slowly, through endless days and endless nights, they began to learn. They learned which tracks meant danger and which meant food. They learned to follow the seasons, chasing rains and migrations. They learned to endure, step by step, against a world that seemed determined to erase them. The savannah carved them into something new. Every predator had teeth. Every storm had power. Every drought had hunger. But humanity had something else, invisible, something unmeasured, a spark that could not be seen, yet could be felt in every trembling hand that dared hold a stone, in every eye that lingered on the stars, in every cry that echoed across the plains. And so, in the theater of shadows, the first act of human courage was written. But courage alone was not enough. Survival demanded more than bravery. It demanded imagination. It demanded the ability not just to react, but to foresee, to look at the shadow in the grass and wonder, what if? The savannah was shaping more than their bodies. It was shaping their minds. And slowly thought itself began to sharpen like stone. And now, the whisper had become a voice. The savannah had taught them fear. The fire had taught them courage. But now, something unseen began to stir, something deeper, stranger, and far more dangerous than any predator. A spark of thought. It began in silence, in the private chambers of the mind. A hunter, kneeling beside a stream, staring at the ripples as if they carried messages. A mother tracing lines in the dirt with her finger, shapes that meant nothing, yet somehow felt like more than idle marks. A child holding a stone, turning it over and over, as if searching for a hidden meaning inside its weight. The world had always spoken, in wind and rain, in claw and fang. But now, humanity began to answer. At first, thought was survival. How to sharpen a stone more effectively. How to use a branch not only as a stick, but as a weapon. How to notice that fire not only burned, but preserved meat, drove away insects, softened the night. But soon, thought stretched beyond survival. It began to wander. It began to wonder. The stars overhead, were they eyes? Were they fires? Were they fires? Were they stories waiting to be told? The moon, why did it grow fat, then thin, then vanish? The horizon, what lay beyond it, beyond the known, beyond the fear? Thoughts swirled like smoke, drifting upward from unseen fires. They could not yet be spoken, but they were felt. Ideas danced in the darkness, restless, insistent, demanding to be born. And with thought came something else, imagination. The humans looked at stone and saw not just stone, but tools, weapons, symbols. They looked at animals and saw not just meat, but power, mystery, meaning. They looked at fire and saw not only warmth, but a spirit that breathed and consumed. Every shadow became a canvas. Every sound carried a secret. The world itself transformed, not by changing, but by being seen differently. And in that difference lay the seed of everything that would follow: art, belief, science, civilization. But in these early moments, it was only a whisper, a fragile spark in the great dark of time. One night, beneath a canopy of stars, a group huddled around their fire. Shadows stretched across the stone walls of a shallow cave. The flames flickered, and the humans watched as shapes twisted and danced. A hunter raised his hand, moving it in front of the firelight. On the wall, his shadow stretched into something larger, something monstrous. The others gasped, eyes wide. Was this magic? Was this power? Or was it the beginning of story? Perhaps it was all three. The humans began to play with the light, moving their hands, their bodies, casting shadows that looked like animals, like spirits, like dreams. Laughter echoed, sharp and surprising. But beneath the laughter was awe. For the first time, they were not only living in the world, they were beginning to shape it. The spark of thought was catching flame, and with imagination came danger, for thought could not be contained. Once it began, it spread like fire in dry grass, devouring everything it touched. It asked questions that could not yet be answered. It carried visions that could not yet be spoken. It pulled humanity forward, step by step, into mysteries too vast for their fragile hearts to hold. One night, lightning struck far off across the plain. The humans watched the storm in silence, thunder shaking the ground. A child, trembling, pressed into her mother's side and pointed to the sky. Her eyes asked the question her mouth could not: why? And in that moment, the spark became something irreversible. Forethought was no longer about what could be touched, hunted, or held. It had reached upward, toward the infinite, toward the unknowable. What is lightning? What are stars? What is death? These questions, unspoken yet alive, settled into the human mind like seeds waiting for rain. They would grow into myths, into religions, into philosophies. But now, in the earliest days, they were simply shadows, mysterious, beautiful, terrifying. The humans began to gather, not only for warmth or safety, but for meaning. The fire became a place of wonder, where sparks mirrored stars, and shadows hinted at hidden worlds. And always, in the silence between crackles, the same unspoken question pulsed. Who are we? The predators still prowled, the hunger still gnawed. But now, something had shifted. Humanity was not only surviving the world, they were beginning to imagine it, to see beyond what was, and dream of what might be. And in that dream lay power greater than tooth or claw. But dreams carry both light and darkness. For to dream is to risk despair, to imagine is to fear what might be, and to think is to realize just how fragile life truly is. The spark of thought burned brightly, but every fire leaves shadows. The spark of thought burned quietly in the human mind, restless and uncontained. But sparks, if they linger long enough, seek fuel. They hunger for something greater, something that can carry them forward. And so it happened. Thought found its first vessel, the human voice. It began as sound, not the cries of fear, not the growls of anger, but something different, something shaped, a call stretched longer than instinct required, a syllable repeated, echoing in rhythm, as if the sound itself wanted to stay, wanted to live. At first, it was clumsy, a hum to soothe. But slowly, across countless nights and countless fires, those sounds began to take form. Imagine it one human pointing to the sky and making a noise, a sound no animal had ever made before. Another repeating it, the shape of the sound catching like a flame. Suddenly, the nameless sky had a sound attached to it. A thread had been tied between thought and voice, and with that thread, humanity crossed a threshold. Language. It was not just noise. It was invisible fire passing from mouth to ear, from ear to mind, from mind to heart. It was the bridge between one thought and another, the bond between separate souls. Around the fire, the first conversations were born, not as we know them, no complex sentences, no poetry yet, but beginnings. The ability to point and share, to call and warn, to comfort and dream. Language spread like light across the dark plain. Suddenly, ideas were not trapped in one mind. They could leap, carried on breath, carried on sound. One person's vision could live in another's memory. A lesson learned in hunger could echo long after hunger had passed. The humans sat in circles, their shadows leaping on cave walls, their voices layering into something more than survival. They laughed at sounds that bounced strangely in their mouths. They discovered that to name a thing was to hold it, to claim it, to shape it. A child cried out, and a mother gave that cry a pattern, a melody. Comfort wrapped itself in sound, and in that sound, a connection deeper than touch was born. Language was a fire no storm could extinguish, but fire, as always, is not only warmth, for with words came memory, with memory came weight, with weight came longing, regret, hope. One night, beneath a silver moon, an elder sat apart from the fire. His eyes were tired, his body frail. A young child approached him, pointing to the stars with a questioning sound. The elder exhaled, shaping a noise, a name. The child repeated it, delighted. But in the elder's eyes, shadows stirred. For he understood something the child did not. Words would outlive bodies. A name could echo long after breath was gone. And so, with language, the humans stepped into something new, the realm of meaning. They no longer lived only in the present moment. Words could recall the past, could point toward the future. A warning shouted could save lives tomorrow. A memory shared could prevent suffering yet to come. The invisible fire grew, but even as it spread, it carried a hidden danger. For if language could connect, it could also divide. If words could heal, they could wound. If they could tell truth, they could also tell lies. Already, shadows stirred in the flicker of this new fire. But the humans did not yet know this. To them, every sound was a miracle, every shared meaning a treasure. They sat by their fires, voices rising into the night, and for the first time, silence was not the only companion of stars. The night itself seemed to change. Where once there had been only whispers of wind and the distant call of predators, now there was music rough, halting, beautiful. The first chorus of humanity. Perhaps, if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The murmur of ancient voices, fragile but determined, carried across time like an echo that never fades. Language had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. Language had given humans a new fire, but this fire was unlike the flames that danced on sticks or the embers that glowed in ash. This was a fire that burned inside the mind, a light that reached into darkness, not of night, but of time itself, memory. Before words, memories lived only in silence, fragile and fleeting, like footprints washed away by rain. The lessons of the hunt, the grief of loss, the wonder of the stars, all dissolved when the body that held them returned to dust. But now, with language, memories could leap from one soul to another. They could live beyond a single life, and so, around the fire, stories began. At first, they were simple shadows of the day retold in sound. The hunt, the chase, the narrow escape, a warning about the river, a caution about the beasts. These were maps, but not of land. They were maps of experience, passed down not on stone or clay, but in breath, in voice, in memory. Each story was a torch, lit in one hand and carried to the next. But soon, stories grew into something larger. They became not just warnings, but wonders. The lightning in the sky became a spirit. The great predator became a god. The stars above became ancestors, watching, waiting. Through stories, humans began to stitch patterns across the unknown. The chaos of existence became threads of meaning, woven into tapestries of myth and memory. And in this weaving, the human soul was born. The fire crackled, shadows danced, voices rose. Children leaned forward, eyes wide, listening not only with their ears, but with their hearts. For the first time, they knew the world was bigger than their own small lives. They were part of a chain, a river of memory flowing from the past into the future. But rivers, though they nourish, can also flood. Memory was a gift, but it carried weight. To remember meant to grieve. To recall meant to long for what was lost. To keep the dead alive in story meant never escaping their shadow. One night, as embers glowed low, a young woman spoke softly of her brother who had been taken by a lion. She mimed his bravery, the way he had stood against the beast. Her voice trembled, yet she continued, shaping his death into something more than silence. The others listened, their own griefs awakened, for in her story they saw not only the loss of one life, but the truth of their own fragile existence. The fire popped, sparks rose like tiny stars, and in that moment the group understood something new. Death was not the end. Not if memory could carry the name, the story, the spirit. And so, memory became immortality. But immortality came with a shadow. For once, humans could look backward. They also began to look forward. The memory of yesterday became the fear of tomorrow. To imagine the death of others was grief. To imagine one's own death was terror. The map of memory carried not only knowledge, but anxiety, not only comfort, but dread. Still, they could not let it go. Memory was too powerful, too beautiful, too necessary. With it, they began to mark the land in their minds. Rivers and hills, groves and caves all became places filled with memory, with meaning. They were no longer just bodies moving through wilderness. They were minds carrying a living map, and slowly these maps began to bind them together. A hunter could tell others where the herds had gone. An elder could recall the patterns of rain. A mother could warn of the dangers hidden in a valley. Memory connected them across generations. It was a bridge from those who had lived to those who had not yet been born. But bridges can collapse. For once, humans could tell stories. They could also shape them. A tale could grow larger than truth. A warning could become a myth. A memory could bend into legend. And legends, once born, refused to die. The night sky became a canvas of such legends. Hunters pointed to constellations and spoke of beasts, heroes, spirits. The flicker of firelight turned ordinary shadows into sacred shapes. The earth itself became alive not because it had changed, but because memory and imagination had painted it so and so. The first dreams of gods were born, but not all stories were gentle. Some carried fear, some demanded obedience, some whispered of dangers unseen, curses unbroken, punishments unending. Memory could guide, but it could also haunt. One night, a child awoke, screaming, haunted by a dream. The elders gathered, speaking in hushed voices, shaping the nightmare into a story. The dream was no longer only the child's, it belonged to the group. They carried it together, interpreting, fearing, remembering. For memory was no longer private. It was communal, shared, eternal. The humans were becoming more than individuals. They were becoming a people, but every step forward carried them deeper into mystery. For with memory came questions larger than survival. Who are we? Where do we go when breath ceases? Why do the stars burn so patiently above us? The stories tried to answer, but the answers only led to more questions. The map of memory stretched endlessly, leading into shadows they could not yet walk. Still, they followed, for the human soul had awoken, and once awake, it could not return to silence. The fire had carried stories, and stories had carried memory. But memory alone could not hold a people together. What bound them now was something deeper, something carved not into stone, but into the marrow of their bones, the bond of the tribe. For the human alone was fragile. A single pair of hands could not bring down the mammoth. A single voice could not keep the night at bay. But together, as many hands, many voices, many hearts, they were more than fragile flesh. Together, they were a force of nature. The tribe was a shield. The weak could lean on the strong. The young could be protected by the old, and the old could live on in the lessons they had given. The tribe was a net stretched across the abyss of existence, catching those who might otherwise fall. Yet the tribe was not born in peace. It was forged in conflict, in need, in survival. At first, it was blood that bound. Brothers and sisters, parents and children, kinship etched by birth. But as numbers grew, strangers joined. Outsiders became allies. And in this fragile weaving, the first tensions appeared. For what makes someone one of us? What divides the circle of belonging from the darkness of the unknown? Around the fire, these questions burned as fiercely as the flames themselves. A child would cry, and not only the mother but the whole group would move. Food would be found, and it would be shared, though not always equally. A hunter might boast of his kill, but his triumph was nothing if not carried home to the waiting mouths of others. The tribe was a paradox. It demanded sacrifice, yet it gave protection. It limited freedom, yet it offered safety. And within this paradox, humans began to change. They learned to read the hidden signals of one another, the flicker of eyes, the tremble of lips, the tightening of hands. They felt not only their own hunger, but the hunger of those beside them. They felt not only their own fear, but the fear of the group. It was empathy, a mirror in the soul, the ability to carry another's burden as if it were one's own. This was more than survival. It was a quiet revolution. For with empathy, the tribe became more than numbers. It became a living thing, a single body with many faces. Each member was a cell, a part of the whole. Each voice was a heartbeat. The tribe alive. But even the strongest bodies fall ill. Whispers began to rise in the shadows. Envy, jealousy, doubt. Who deserved the choicest meat? Who carried the greatest share of the burden? Who could be trusted? The tribe could nurture, but it could also punish. The same hands that reached to feed could also point in blame. The same voices that sang could also accuse. And the outcast, cast beyond the circle of belonging, faced a fate more terrifying than death. To be utterly alone, to be without the tribe, was to be without meaning, without memory, without protection. It was to be swallowed by silence. And so humans learned to bend themselves for the sake of belonging. They learned to give, to hide, to obey. They learned to weave their own desires into the desires of the group. This was the price of the tribe, but it was also its gift. For together, they created more than survival. They created song, the first rhythms of feet on earth, hands on skin, voices rising together in patterns that echoed like heartbeat and rain. They created ritual, the dance. Before the hunt, the chant for the dead, the circle of fire where myths were born. The tribe gave shape to time itself. Days and nights were no longer only cycles of light and dark. They became seasons of gathering, seasons of grieving, seasons of celebration. And in these rhythms, the tribe grew stronger than the sum of its parts. The mammoth fell, not because of one spear, but because of many. The child survived, not because of one pair of arms, but because of many. The predator fled, not because of one cry, but because of a chorus of voices rising in unison. Humans were no longer prey. They were becoming something new, but with power came danger. The tribe, though bound by love, could also be bound by fear. Fear of outsiders, fear of betrayal, fear of the unknown. And in the name of protection, suspicion grew sharp. The circle of belonging tightened. Those beyond it became shadows, threats, enemies. They also learned to fear the stranger, and that fear would shape the destiny of their kind. Yet still, in the quiet moments, when the hunt was done and the fire burned low, the tribe became a cradle of tenderness, a hand on a shoulder, a lullaby sung to restless children, a smile shared between weary hunters. In those fragile gestures, humanity bloomed. For belonging was not only protection from death, it was proof of life. Proof that one's breath, one's story, one's small existence mattered. But beyond the firelight, another tribe watched. Eyes glittered in the dark. Voices whispered in a tongue not their own. Another group, another circle, another people separate, yet not so different, and soon their paths would cross. The wilderness was vast, but not empty. For every fire that flickered in the night, another burned beyond the horizon. For every song that rose in the forest, another echoed from a distant valley. Humanity was not alone, not even in its earliest days. At first, they did not know. They thought themselves the only circle of fire, the only voices beneath the stars. But then came the footprints, strange, human-shaped, yet not their own. The mark of another tribe. The proof that somewhere, beyond the trees and the rivers, there were others. The discovery stirred both awe and fear. The tribe whispered of them in secret. Were they ghosts? Were they gods? Or were they simply humans, like themselves, hungry, wary, watchful? None could say, and yet the knowledge spread like a shadow across every firelit night. Then, one evening, they saw them, shapes moving at the edge of vision. Not beasts, not shadows, but men and women with faces, hands, eyes, the same firelight in their gaze, the same breath in their chests. Strangers, yet mirrors. The first encounter was not gentle. Fear leaped like a spark from one tribe to the other. Spears were raised, voices shouted, stones flew. Each side saw the other not as kin, but as threat. The wilderness, already dangerous, now seemed doubled in menace. For beyond the predator and the storm, there was now the danger of another tribe. The clash was brief, but it left wounds. A hunter lay bleeding by the river. A child wailed for a father who would not return. And the tribe, once secure in its circle, felt for the first time the weight of human conflict. Yet even in fear, curiosity, smoldred. In the stolen glimpses of the other tribe, they saw echoes of themselves. A woman carrying water in a hollowed shell, a boy with eyes wide, clutching a stick. A man who looked at them not with rage, but with something closer to sorrow. They were strangers, yes, but they were also familiar. And so, the whispers shifted. If they are like us, do they dream? Do they love? Do they mourn their dead as we do? Do their fires warm them as ours warms us? The questions lingered, unanswered. Still, fear reigned. The tribe learned to guard its borders, to post watchers at night, to mark its territory with signs of presence. The wilderness became a chessboard, each step measured, each hunt shadowed by the possibility of encounter. But conflict was not the only path. There came a night when hunger pressed heavy upon them. The herds had wandered far, the rivers yielded. Little children cried, elders weakened, desperation gnawed like teeth, and in that hunger they stumbled upon the other tribe, equally desperate, equally starving. For a moment, weapons lifted, eyes hardened, but then something broke. One woman stepped forward, her hands empty, her voice low. She offered not a weapon, but food, small, meager, yet shared, and in that fragile gesture, the wilderness shifted. The two tribes sat across the fire, eyes never leaving one another. They exchanged not words, they did not yet share a tongue, but glances, gestures, offerings, a strip of meat, a carved tool, a shell filled with water. It was uneasy, it was fragile, it was the beginning of something new. For in that meeting, humanity glimpsed the first spark of alliance, the realization that the stranger could be more than a threat. The stranger could be an extension of the self. But even as one hand reached, another gripped the spear tighter. Trust was a river that flowed slowly, and fear was a dam always threatening to break. The tribes parted with dawn, retreating to their separate circles, yet neither was unchanged. In the days that followed, dreams grew restless. Some dreamt of friendship, of great gatherings, where many fires joined. Others dreamt of blood, of battles waged, until one tribe remained. The future of humanity hung in this fragile balance, between cooperation and conflict, between trust and fear, and beneath the stars, unseen by either tribe, the universe watched in silence. For here, in these trembling first encounters, lay the seeds of everything to come: war and peace, love and betrayal, empire and ruin. The destiny of humankind had cracked open, and nothing would ever close it again. Dawn came soft, with mist curling through the trees. Yet beneath the hush of birdsong, there was a silence too heavy to ignore. The watchers at the edge of the camp had seen them shapes moving through the forest, faces streaked with ash and clay, eyes glowing like coals. The strangers had returned, but this time they came not to share, not to offer food or gesture peace. This time their bodies told a different story. Their skin was marked, painted in lines and spirals that turned men into something more than men, women into something more than women. They had become symbols, walking myths, wearing the faces of spirits and beasts. War had entered the human story. At first it was only a clash of noise and terror. Shouts tore through the forest, feet thundered on soil, weapons struck with the awkward fury of desperation. Stone against bone, wood against flesh. The cries of the living tangled with the silence of the dead. The tribe fought not because they understood war, but because fear demanded it. Fear of losing food, fear of losing fire, fear of losing children. Fear was the drumbeat that guided their hands, turning hesitation into strike, turning caution into rage. And yet, even in the chaos, something strange was born. The painted faces were not only meant to frighten, they were masks of belonging. Each mark declared, "You are one of us." To fight side by side, to bleed for one another, was to prove loyalty, to prove love twisted into defense. War was horror, but it was also unity. Those who fought together became bound by more than blood. They became brothers, not only by birth, but by battle. Sisters, not only by kin, but by sacrifice. The first scars of war were carved not only on flesh, but on memory. When the painted ones withdrew, leaving behind broken bodies and smoldering fire, the survivors did not return to silence. They gathered, trembling, weeping, yet alive. And in their grief, in their anger, they told the story. They spoke of the fallen, their names whispered like prayers. They spoke of the attack, their gestures carving the air. They spoke of vengeance, of courage, of the ones who had stood and not fallen. And so war gave birth to legend. But legends are not harmless. Legends can ignite like sparks in dry grass. The tribe began to paint themselves, to take ash and clay, to draw on their faces the marks of beasts and spirits. If the painted ones had made themselves more than human, then they too would transform. This was not only defense, it was becoming, for war had given them something beyond survival. It had given them identity, a sense of we are us and they are them. The line between friend and stranger grew sharper, harder, more dangerous. Still, in the quiet after the storm, doubt whispered. The children asked why. Why must we fight? Why must blood fall to feed the soil? Could the strangers not be friends, as once they seemed by the fire? But no answer came, only silence. For war had no simple reason. It was born not only from hunger or need, but from fear itself, the fear of losing what was ours, the fear of trusting what was not. The tribe learned new rhythms, not only the rhythms of song or dance, but the pounding rhythm of preparation. Spears sharpened, fires watched, sleep taken in shifts. The nights grew longer, not because the stars had changed, but because the human heart now carried shadows within it. And yet, in this darkness, a strange light flickered, for war demanded not only violence, but strategy, not only rage, but thought. Where once a hunt required cunning, now the tribe turned that cunning upon their fellow humans. They learned ambush, deception, alliance. They learned to imagine not only their own movements, but the movements of the enemy. It was the birth of strategy, the first spark of what would one day become art and science, politics and empire. But at what cost? The tribe grew stronger, yes, but also harder. Grief etched itself into their voices. Fear lingered in their eyes. And children grew up learning not only to walk, but to fight. The fire, once a place of story and song, became also a place of memory, of the fallen memory of the painted faces that haunted their dreams. The wilderness had changed. Humanity had changed. And somewhere, in the distance, the painted ones were also changing. For they, too, told their stories. They, too, grieved their dead. They, too, painted their faces with the ash of sorrow and the clay of survival. Perhaps they were not so different. Perhaps their fear was the same. Perhaps war was not the mark of the stranger, but the mark of being human. But such thoughts could not be spoken aloud. Not yet, for the fires were burning again. Watchers saw smoke on the horizon. The painted ones were gathering once more, not fewer, but many. And this time the clash would not be brief. This time the earth itself would tremble. The smoke of battle had faded, yet its shadow remained. Around the fire, the tribe nursed its wounds. Some mourned in silence, others whispered vengeance. All of them waited for what they did not yet know. It was then that something new stirred. Among them, in the chaos of war, one voice had risen louder than the rest. One pair of eyes had seen further than fear. One hand had steadied when others trembled. The tribe remembered who had called them to stand together, who had guided them through the storm, and so, without words for it, they began to follow. Leadership was born. It did not begin with crowns or thrones, but with trust. A hunter who knew the path of beasts better than others. A woman whose hands healed wounds and soothed children. An elder whose stories carried not only memory, but wisdom. Power was not yet taken, it was given, placed like an ember into the hands of those who could carry it without letting it die. But fire is never content to remain small at first. Leadership was gentle, a voice among voices, a hand that pointed the way. But as the tribe grew, as conflict deepened, the leader's voice grew heavier, sharper, harder to question, for survival demanded decisions. Who would hunt and who would stay? Who would eat and who would go hungry? Who would fight and who would hide? Each choice was a stone dropped into water, and the ripples reached every life. The tribe discovered something both powerful and dangerous. Authority, and with authority came hierarchy. No longer were all voices equal. Some were lifted above the rest, praised, obeyed. Others were lowered, silenced, bent beneath the weight of command. The circle of fire was still unbroken, but within it, lines had been drawn. The first sparks of power had ignited, and once lit, they could not be extinguished. Power changed everything. The leader's word could bring peace or war. A gesture could feed one family and starve another. The tribe began to measure itself, not only in kinship, but in status. Who stood nearest the fire? Who spoke first? Who carried the weapons? And who carried only burdens? And yet, this structure gave them strength. For with power came unity, with unity came strategy, and with strategy came survival. The mammoth fell not by chance, but by plan. The hunters moved as one, guided by a vision larger than any single mind. The children were taught not only to live, but to serve. The elders, though frail, held sway in council. The tribe was no longer only a gathering. It was becoming something greater, a society. But in the cracks of this new order, shadows gathered, for where power gathers, so too does ambition. The leader was not alone. Others hungered for the same fire. Others whispered in the dark, plotting, questioning, doubting. Power was no longer only a gifted, was a prize, and prizes can be stolen. The first struggles for dominance began quietly, a challenge in the hunt, a refusal to obey, a rumor, a glance, a spark of resentment. But sparks, left unchecked, become flames. The tribe soon discovered a new kind of war, one not fought with painted faces in the wilderness, but within their own circle. The war of politics, of rivalry, of ambition. It was no less dangerous than the clash of spears, for betrayal can cut deeper than any stone blade. Still, even as tension simmered, humanity climbed higher. Authority gave them vision, hierarchy gave them structure, and structure gave them strength. They could dream of hunts yet to come, of journeys yet to be taken. They could plan not only for the day, but for the season, for the year. The leader, sitting by the fire, no longer thought only of the next hunt. They thought of the future. They thought of destiny. And in their eyes, others began to see something more than human. The first seeds of reverence were sown. Leaders became not only guides, but symbols. Their voices carried the weight of the tribe's survival. Their decisions shaped lives. And in this growing reverence lay the fragile roots of power that would in time bloom into kingship, into thrones, into empires. But the soil was not yet steady, for power is a fire that can warm or burn, protect or consume, and somewhere beyond, the trees, the painted ones, were gathering again. They too had leaders. They too had power. They too had ambition. The world of tribes was beginning to shift into something larger, heavier, more dangerous. The wilderness was no longer only a place of beasts and storms. It was becoming a place of human power, and when power meets power, the earth itself trembles. The horizon no longer belonged to a single tribe. Across valleys and forests, across rivers and plains, more circles of fire burned in the night. Each fire carried its own stories, its own leaders, its own gods whispered into the stars. Humanity was multiplying, and with it, the world grew smaller. But closeness is a double-edged blade, where once a tribe might wander for years without seeing another. Now paths began to cross with alarming frequency. Hunters stumbled into hunters. Gatherers found footprints where there had been none before. The wilderness, once vast and empty, now felt crowded with shadows. And so began the gathering storm. At first, tribes met with caution. Exchanges were brief food for stone, shells for meat, a glance, a nod, a retreat, yet the seeds of something larger were being sown. For each meeting left questions in its wake. Could we trade more? Could we join forces? Could we share the hunt, the river, the fire? But with the questions came suspicion, for every tribe carried its own scars, its own fears. What if they take more than they give? What if they steal in the night? What if their leaders hunger for more than peace? Trust and doubt danced like twin shadows, flickering with every encounter. Then came the first alliance. Two tribes, weary from conflict, found themselves pressed by hunger. The herds had moved north, beyond the reach of either group alone, and so, reluctantly, they joined. Spears side by side, voices chanting as one. They brought down beasts too mighty for a single circle of fire. The victory was intoxicating together. They feasted as never before. Songs rose louder, drums beat faster, and for a fleeting moment, humanity glimpsed a power greater than any single tribe. Unity, but unity is fragile. For within it lay the question of leadership. Whose voice would guide? Whose fire would burn brightest? Whose gods would be honored? The first alliance became the first rivalry. Suspicion coiled once more, striking with the venom of ambition. And when blood spilled, it was not only the painted strangers who fought. It was allies, once brothers, turning spears against one another. The wilderness thundered with battles not of survival, but of pride. Still, even in blood, humanity learned, for in every clash, in every broken alliance, new patterns were born. Leaders began to see not only the danger of enemies, but the power of allies. They began to dream of tribes bound not just for a hunt, not just for a season, but forever. The dream of nations was stirring. It began with symbols, painted marks, not only of war, but of belonging. Totems carved from bone and wood, raised high, as banners of identity. Songs that were sung not by families, but by hundreds of voices, each carrying the same refrain. The tribe was no longer only kin by blood. It was kin by choice, by loyalty, by symbol. Humanity was becoming something larger than itself. But with size came storms. The larger the circle, the greater the tensions within it. Disputes over food, over land, over leaders. And every dispute threatened to tear apart what had only just been woven. Some leaders ruled by wisdom, speaking with calm, weaving peace where conflict threatened. Others ruled by fear, their voices sharp, their punishments swift. The balance of power wavered, shifting like firelight on stone. And beyond these fragile alliances, other tribes watched. They saw the strength of unity. They saw the weakness of division. And in their silence, they prepared. The gathering storm was no longer only whispers in the night. It was drums on the horizon, a rumble like thunder carried across valleys and rivers. Humanity stood at a threshold. Would they join together, forming something greater than the sum of their parts? Or would they splinter, turning unity into endless war? The answer was not yet clear, but in the distance, smoke rose once more. Not the smoke of a single fire, nor even two. This was a column of darkness, stretching high into the sky, a blaze too vast to belong to any one tribe. It was a sign, a warning, a promise. The age of tribes was ending. Something larger was awakening. Something heavier, more dangerous, more magnificent. The storm was no longer coming. The storm was here. The storm of tribes had gathered, and in its roar, humanity discovered a truth. Bodies alone could not hold them together. Spears broke, leaders fell, alliances shattered. What remained, what lingered in the ashes, were not only wounds, but stories. And stories began to matter more than blood. For in the quiet after battle, around the trembling fire, people sought meaning. Why had they survived when others had not? Why did the river flood one year and vanish the next? Why did the sun return after sinking into the abyss of night? Questions became whispers, whispers became myths, and myths became belief. The first gods were not carved in stone, but born in the breath of frightened children and weary hunters. A shadow moving across the moon was not just a shadow, it was a spirit, watching, judging, waiting. The rumble of thunder was not simply sky against sky, it was the voice of something vast, something that demanded to be obeyed. And so humanity began to bow, not only to chiefs or to spears, but to the unseen. With belief came unity. A tribe no longer sang only of ancestors. They sang of the same gods, the same spirits, the same mysteries. Rituals grew from these songs, movements of hands, dances in circles, offerings cast into fire or river. Each gesture was a thread weaving hundreds of people together, binding them to something greater than themselves. But belief carried a double edge, for what one tribe called sacred, another called false. What one saw as blessing, another saw as curse. And when beliefs collided, the storm that followed was not only of spears, but of souls. Leaders saw the power of this new force. A chief's command might fade, but the command of the gods lingered in the hearts of the people. To rule by spear was fragile. To rule by myth was eternal. Thus began the first priest-kings, men and women who spoke not only for themselves, but for the gods. Their words became law, their visions unchallenged. To doubt them was not to question a person, but to defy the heavens themselves. Yet behind their voices, another truth stirred. Belief did not only belong to rulers. It belonged to the people, the dreamers, the the storytellers who whispered under the stars. In the quietest corners of the night, new myths were born, fragile as sparks drifting into the sky. Myths of creation, of death, of the unseen roads that souls must travel when breath is gone. And within those myths lay both hope and fear. Hope that death was not the end, but a passage. Fear that unseen eyes judged every action, every thought. Humanity's world expanded beyond what they could touch. The invisible was now as real as the earth beneath their feet, but belief is never still. One night, in a clearing where 3 tribes had gathered, a vision changed everything. A young seer, trembling in firelight, claimed to see a figure rising from the smoke, taller than the trees, brighter than the stars. She spoke of unity, of many fires burning as one, of voices lifted not in conflict but in harmony. Some wept at her words. Others felt terror coil in their bellies. For if belief could unite, it could also consume. To follow a vision was to surrender to something unseen, something untested. To refuse was to stand against not only a leader, but against the very fabric of faith. The clearing erupted in cries, some of devotion, some of rage. And in that moment, humanity discovered that the storm within the soul could burn hotter than any battle of spears. Still, the vision spread, stories of gods walking the earth, of spirits guiding hunts, of ancestors watching from the stars. These stories leaped from fire to fire, from tribe to tribe, weaving invisible bridges across distances once impossible. The first nations were not built with stone or walls. They were built with belief, but belief had a price. As unity grew, so, too, did division. For every god embraced, another was denied. For every myth cherished, another was declared false. The storm that once raged over land now raged within hearts, setting tribe against tribe, faith against faith. And yet, in that storm, humanity found a new question, perhaps its most dangerous yet. If belief could bind them, if stories could shape them, what other truths might lie hidden, waiting to be imagined into existence? The question of gods lingered in the night air, heavy and unsettling, yet life pressed forward. The tribes, no longer content to drift endlessly across rivers and plains, began to settle. What had once been fleeting fires left behind ashes now became walls, foundations, and roots driven deep into the soil. The first cities were not born in silence. They rose like great experiments, fragile yet magnificent. A cluster of huts near a river grew into rows, then streets. Clay hardened into brick. Stone was stacked upon stone, trembling under its own weight, but daring to reach higher than any hut before. Humanity had begun to carve permanence into the world, and permanence was intoxicating. For the first time, people walked streets that echoed with voices not of a single tribe, but of many. Markets bloomed where hunters once stalked. Fishers laid their catch beside the woven baskets of gatherers, beside the hides of hunters, beside the carved idols of priests. Exchange was no longer survival, it was abundance. But abundance came with shadows. Walls rose not only to protect, but to divide. Within the walls, people belonged. Beyond them, they were strangers. The circle of fire had become a circle of stone, and with it, the question returned: who belongs within, and who must remain outside? Rulers answered this question swiftly. The priest kings of old, Those who spoke with the voices of gods now sat upon thrones carved from stone. Their words were etched into tablets, their decrees pressed into clay. The law was no longer just memory carried by elders, it was written, preserved, made permanent, and in this permanence, power deepened. But beneath the grandeur of walls and temples, the streets whispered another story. Children ran barefoot, their laughter mingling with the cries of merchants. Dogs scavenged near piles of waste. The smell of smoke, bread, and sweat filled the air. For every palace that glittered in the sun, shadows of poverty stretched long. Across the alleys, the city was not only a place of unity, it was a mirror of inequality. Some feasted, others starved. Some prayed in golden temples, others begged outside their gates. And as the gap widened, so too did tension. The first cities became theaters of power, and power demanded display. Towers rose higher, temples grew grander, walls thicker. Humanity was no longer only surviving, it was performing, reaching for the heavens, desperate to prove permanence against the fragile truth of mortality. Night. A storm broke across a river city. The waters rose higher than the walls, sweeping through streets, dragging away huts, markets, even idols of stone. In the morning, survivors stood stunned among ruins, realizing that no wall, no king, no god could hold back the chaos of the earth itself. And so, another question was born. If walls could fall, if cities could drown, then what truly lasts? In the silence after the storm, priests gathered the people. They spoke of wrathful gods, of punishment for forgotten rituals, of sacrifices left undone. Fear tightened its grip. Fires were lit, chants rose, and blood was spilled in the hope of appeasing unseen powers. But others looked at the ruins and saw something else. They saw not wrath, but nature, not punishment, but chance. The river had no malice, it simply moved, as it always hadn't aimed, indifferent. These voices were few, fragile, easily drowned by the roar of faith. Yet they carried within them a spark of something new risen. The faint beginnings of questioning not only kings and gods, but the very nature of the world. Still, the city rebuilt. Humanity always rebuilds. Each time higher, stronger, more ambitious. The first ziggurats rose, stairways of stone clawing toward the sky. To climb them was to step closer to the gods. To build them was to prove that humanity's hands could shape not only earth, but destiny. And yet, with every stone lifted higher, the storm within grew darker. For the more a city prospered, the more others coveted. Beyond the walls, nomads watched, tribes listened, hungry eyes turned toward granaries filled with grain, temples glimmering with offerings. The first cities were not only cradles of culture, they were targets, and soon spears would not clash only in the wilderness, but against stone walls. The dust rose first, a trembling veil across the horizon. Then came the sound low, distant, like thunder rolling from the earth itself. The watchmen on the walls leaned forward, hearts caught in their throats. What moved toward them was not a wandering band of hunters. It was something new, something dreadful. It was an army, men and women, painted in ash, carrying spears, not for hunting, but for conquest. Shields made of wood and hide glinted in the rising sun. Their voices rose in chants, each step beating into the earth like the drum of inevitability. For the first time, A city looked outward and saw not only neighbors or strangers, but enemies united by purpose. War had arrived. The people within the walls trembled. Some prayed to gods, whispering into the air. Others sharpened blades, stacking stones for defense. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting flames that had not yet burned but surely would. The rulers stood tall, or at least pretended to. From balconies of carved stone, they raised their arms and promised protection, promised victory, but their voices quivered. For even they knew the truth. No city had yet faced a storm like this, and when the storm struck, it was not the clash of two hunters in the forest. It was a roar of chaos, a symphony of fear and fury. Arrows darkened the sky, stones hurled from slings shattered against walls. Fire licked across thatched roofs, turning prayers into screams. The defenders fought desperately, hurling spears from the walls, their cries mixing with the clash of metal on wood. The air thickened with smoke, dust, and blood. For hours that felt like lifetimes, the city trembled on the edge of destruction. And then something shifted. For war is not only strength, it is strategy. A band of defenders, guided by instinct or desperation, poured boiling water from the walls. Flames turned against the invaders, smoke blinding their advance. The chants faltered. The tide hesitated. In that hesitation, humanity learned its next lesson. Wars could be won. The invaders retreated, their cries fading into the distance. The city, though scarred and bleeding, still stood. From the walls, voices erupted in relief, in triumph. They had survived. They had defended what was theirs, but survival left scars deeper than wounds. The streets were littered with ash and bodies. The granaries smoldered. The air stank of death and smoke. Mothers wept for children lost. Fathers buried brothers. And yet, even in mourning, a new fire smoldered in the hearts of survivors. They had tasted war. They would not forget it. The priest-kings declared it a victory ordained by the gods. Rituals were performed, sacrifices made, to ensure protection in the battles yet to come. But beneath the chants and offerings, another truth grew quietly. Survival had depended not on gods, but on walls, weapons, and human hands. And so, weapons grew sharper, walls thicker, leaders more cunning. War had revealed not only destruction, but innovation. For in every battle, humanity learned. They learned how to march in unison, how to strike as one. They learned the strength of formations, the power of strategy. They learned that victory was not always the strongest spear, but the sharpest mind. And with every lesson, war spread. Cities turned their gaze outward, where once they feared invasion. Now they dreamed of conquest. If enemies could be defeated, they could also be conquered. If walls could defend, they could also imprison. And so, the fires of war leaped from one horizon to another, consuming not just forests and fields, but the very heart of humanity's future. The age of tribes had ended. The age of war had begun. But in the quiet after the battle, as survivors rebuilt walls and mourned their dead, another whisper threaded through the ruins. A whisper not of victory, but of fear. For if one army could rise from the dust, so too could another, larger, stronger, more ruthless, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another city watched the smoke drift into the sky and began to sharpen its spears. The fires of war smoldered in the ruins of cities. But from those ashes, something vast began to stir. Humanity had learned the power of walls, the cost of blood, the cunning of strategy. Now it reached further, daring to weave together not just tribes, not just cities, but entire worlds of people. The first empires rose. They did not begin with kindness. They began with ambition. A single leader, crowned not only by victory but by vision, looked at the conquered and did not see enemies. He saw subjects. To rule them was to grow stronger. To unite them was to grow eternal. And so armies marched not only to defend but to expand. Rivers once seen as boundaries became highways of power. Mountains once feared became borders to be crossed. The earth, once endless and wild, was being measured, divided, claimed. An empire was more than stone and soldiers. It was an idea. Cities that once burned each other's walls now bowed beneath the same banner. Markets swelled with goods from distant land, spices carried across deserts, jewels pulled from mountains, silks spun in valleys far beyond the horizon. Languages collided, mixing into new tongues. Beliefs interwove, forming pantheons of gods vast enough to house conquered souls. But unity, once again, was fragile. For behind every conquest lay resentment. For every banner raised, another was torn down. For every temple built, another was desecrated. The conquered bent their heads, but not their hearts. And beneath the grandeur of palaces and roads, whispers of rebellion lingered. Still, empires grew. Walls gave way to roads stretching like veins across the earth, binding cities together. Granaries fed not hundreds but thousands. Armies swelled into tens of thousands, moving like living beasts across the land. The scale of humanity was changing, but size breeds hunger. The rulers of empires were no longer content with land or wealth. They sought immortality. Their names carved in stone, their likenesses chiseled into monuments towering above the earth. To be remembered was to defy death. To be forgotten was the only true defeat. And so they built great temples that kissed the sky, palaces glittering with gold, statues so vast that even mountains seemed small beside them. To walk among these creations was to feel small, to believe that rulers were not men but gods in flesh. Yet beneath the weight of grandeur, cracks deepened. The roads that carried wealth also carried enemies. The armies that conquered also consumed grain. Wood lives. The monuments that reached for the heavens drained the earth below, and always rebellion. SMOLDERED. For no empire can crush every voice. No throne can silence every dream of freedom. In the dark alleys of great cities, in the hidden valleys of conquered lands, whispers stirred, plans were made, knives were sharpened, and one day those whispers would rise like storms. But not yet, for now the empires stood, dazzling, terrible, magnificent. They turned deserts into gardens, rivers into lifelines, chaos into order. They ruled not only with spears and swords, but with laws, with trade, with belief. Humanity had stepped into a new age, where ambition stretched as far as the horizon itself. Yet even as banners fluttered and drums thundered, a darker truth pressed close. Empires do not only rise, they also fall. And somewhere, in the silence beyond the glittering palaces, a new shadow began to gather, not of armies, not of rebellion, but of something deeper, an idea, the kind of idea that could unravel empires not with fire or sword, but with thought. The empires had risen, their banners high, their towers piercing the clouds. Armies marched, palaces glittered, statues defied the years. But beneath the weight of stone and steel, something invisible began to stir, something stronger than walls, sharper than swords. It began with questions. Why does the sun rise? Why do kings rule? Why must men die? And where do their souls go? These questions were older than fire, whispered in caves and painted on stones. But now, in the great halls of cities, in the shadows of temples, and along the bustling roads of empires, they grew louder, no longer whispers, but challenges, no longer fleeting thoughts, but pursuits. The age of ideas had begun. Philosophers gathered in marketplaces, their words sharper than spears. They spoke of justice not as decreed by kings, but as a truth that might live beyond them. They argued of courage, of love, of the soul's unseen journey. Their voices carried through streets, through palaces, even into the ears of rulers who feared them and yet could not silence them. For how do you kill a thought? Ideas spread like fire in dry grass, leaping from one mind to another. A child heard a question and carried it to his mother. A student repeated a lesson to his friend. A traveler spoke a parable at a distant inn, and by morning it belonged to a new city. And unlike walls or monuments, ideas could not be toppled with a hammer. They could not be drowned in rivers or burned in flames. For every voice silenced, another rose. For every scroll destroyed, another was written. Knowledge became humanity's new weapon. Astronomers lifted their eyes to the sky, charting the dance of stars. They drew patterns, measured shadows, discovered rhythms hidden in the heavens. Mathematicians carved invisible truths into tablets of clay. Physicians searched for cures, not in the wrath of gods, but in the nature of the body. Each discovery was a spark, and soon the night of ignorance glowed with countless embers. But sparks can burn. For every philosopher who asked questions, there was a priest who called him heretic. For every astronomer who mapped the stars, there was a ruler who demanded silence. The clash was no longer only of armies, but of thoughts. In the courts of kings, ideas became as dangerous as rebellion. A word spoken in the wrong company could mean chains, exile, or death. And yet the words were spoken still, because ideas, once born, cannot be unborn. The people began to see their rulers not as gods, but as men. They began to see the laws not as eternal, but as choices. They began to see the world not as mystery, but as puzzle. And with this sight came both liberation and fear. Liberation, because knowledge revealed new paths, of reason, bridges of invention, towers of thought taller than any stone. Fear, because with every answer came another question, and the questions never ended. What if the gods were stories? What if the world was older than memory? What if death was not a doorway, but an ending? These questions shook temples more than any invading army. 4 armies could burn statues, but questions could turn worshippers away. And yet, even as rulers clung to their power, a deeper truth spread across empires. The mind was as vast as the universe it sought to understand. Ideas were infinite, and so humanity stood at a threshold greater than any before. They had built walls, they had raised empires, they had conquered with spears and fire. But now they held in their hands something greater, the power to question everything. But power is never without consequence, for even as thinkers lifted humanity higher, others whispered darker visions. If reason could challenge gods, could it not also justify tyranny? If knowledge could build, could it not also destroy? The same hand that wrote poetry could also design weapons. The same mind that dreamed of freedom could also dream of chains. And so, within the brilliance of the age of ideas, a shadow gathered, a reminder that light and darkness are born together, forever intertwined. It began not with the clash of swords, nor the thunder of cannons, but with something quieter murmur in the streets. A shoemaker whispered to his neighbor, a farmer grumbled about taxes too heavy to bear, a scholar read words forbidden by kings, and slowly, like rain gathering into a flood, the murmurs grew. The age of ideas had planted seeds, and now those seeds split the earth. For too long, empires had ruled by fear. Thrones were lifted high upon the bent backs of the hungry. Palaces glowed with gold while fields lay barren. Kings spoke of divine right, but the people began to ask the dangerous question, why? Why must they kneel? Why must they starve? Why must the few feast while the many suffer? It was a question no sword could cut down, no decree could silence. And so revolutions stirred. In one city, a bell rang, not for prayer, but for rebellion. In another, the market square filled with men and women, their voices louder than armies. Books once hidden in shadows were read aloud in public, their words like fire, freedom, equality, justice. These were not just ideas now. They were demands. The rulers trembled. For centuries, they had built their power on silence. But now, silence was shattered, and when silence breaks, it cannot be mended. Crowds marched. Walls were stormed. Thrones were overturned. The banners of kings were torn down, and in their place rose new symbols, flags of nations, cries of liberty, visions of a world remade. But revolutions are storms. They do not choose what they destroy. The people dreamed of freedom, yet blood filled the streets. Justice was sought, yet vengeance often took its place. Old tyrants were dethroned, yet sometimes new ones rose in their place, wearing different crowns, but ruling with the same iron hand. Still, the world was changed. For the first time in history, rulers were reminded they were not eternal. Thrones could crumble, empires could fall. Power was not divine, was fragile, and it could be taken back. This realization spread like wildfire. Farmers in distant lands heard of kings brought low. Workers in hidden villages whispered of rights never granted. Soldiers in distant armies wondered if they marched for freedom or only for another master. The idea had escaped. No walls could contain it now. And though revolutions often burned themselves out, though some ended in chaos and failure, they left behind something indestructible, the knowledge that people could rise, that history was not only written by rulers, but also by the ruled. It was a terrifying revelation. For if people could shape the fate of kings, what else might they shape? The world itself, the future of humanity. And so, revolutions, whether victorious or broken, marked a turning point in the long, slow march of our species. The sword was no longer the only force that changed history. The voice, the crowd, the uprising, they had become weapons mightier than steel. But with power came danger, for revolutions, once unleashed, cannot be easily controlled. They are storms that sweep across generations, toppling the old and building the new. But storms do not ask permission, and they do not always bring calm skies. Cliffhanger ending of Chapter 16. The fires of revolution still smoldered, yet in the shadows of workshops, a different fire was being kindled, one not of rebellion, but of invention. Hammers rang in hidden forges, wheels turned in secret sheds, steam hissed where once only silence lived. Humanity was awakening, a new force, one far greater than any crown or sword. The machine. At first, it was small, a water wheel grinding grain, a loom weaving cloth faster than human hands, a furnace burning hotter than the sun of summer. But each invention was more than a tool, it was a whisper of possibility. If man could harness water, wind, and fire, what else might he bend to his will? Soon the whispers grew into roars. Engines breathed smoke into the skies. Iron rails carved across continents, and ships powered not by sails but by steam clawed their way across oceans. Where once the world moved at the pace of hooves and wind, now it surged forward like thunder. Villages swelled into cities, fields gave way to factories. The air itself thickened with soot, the rivers with oil. Night no longer belonged to darkness. 4 gas lamps lit the streets, and factories burned their fires without rest. The machine had changed everything, yet, like revolutions before, it was both gift and curse. The gift was power. A single machine could do the work of 50 men. Crops grew faster, fabrics cheaper, steel stronger. The common person, once bound by toil, now glimpsed a life of possibility. The machine promised abundance, promised progress, promised a future faster and brighter than any before. But the curse was chains, for the same factories that built hope also built hunger. Men, women, even children bent their backs beneath the roar of machines. Working from dawn to endless night, their lives consumed by the very engines that promised to free them. The machine had no mercy. It did not care if lungs filled with smoke, if hands bled on iron, if cities choked on their own smog. It devoured everything: wood, coal, metal, flesh. And still, humanity fed it, because once awakened, the machine demanded more more fuel, more labor, more progress, and the people, dazzled and desperate, obeyed. For, with every chain it forged, the machine also unlocked doors. Bridges spanned rivers, once thought uncrossable. Ships shrank oceans into mere weeks of travel. Letters, once carried by weary riders, now flew along wires of copper. Voices traveling faster than wind. The world was shrinking, and humanity for the first time began to feel itself as one. But this shrinking world brought with it new tensions. Nations now had the power to build not only factories, but weapons beyond imagination. Cannons larger, rifles faster, fleets powered by steel instead of wind. The machine was not content with weaving cloth or grinding grain. It had learned to kill. And so, like all revolutions before, progress carried its shadow. The rulers who once feared the voice of the people now feared the roar of industry. Armies marched not only for land, but for coal mines, for steel, for the fuel that fed the machine. Wars of kings were becoming wars of nations, and the machine was always hungry. Yet in the noise and smoke, another whisper could be heard, the whisper of wonder. For even as soot blackened the skies, telescopes revealed stars never seen. Even as factories consumed lives, medicine discovered cures. Even as men bent beneath labor, engineers dreamed of flight, of machines that might one day leave the earth itself. It was a paradox: darkness and light, chains and freedom, destruction and creational, born together from the same awakening. Humanity stood at the threshold of a new age, one it could scarcely control. The machine was no longer just invention, it was destiny. And like destiny, it carried both hope and terror. The machine roared, and with it, nations awoke. Where once kings ruled scattered lands, now entire peoples rose behind banners of shared tongue, shared soil, shared dreams. The world was no longer only empires of dynasty, was becoming a chain of nations, each piece moving with purpose, each eye fixed on the others. The machine gave them strength. Iron rails bound cities together. Telegraphs stitched voices across vast distances. Armies grew faster, harder, deadlier. Nations no longer dreamed in whispers. They dreamed in thunder, and thunder demands an audience. Crowds gathered in public squares, waving flags high, singing songs of belonging. A farmer who had never seen the sea now felt bound to sailors miles away. A factory worker in a smoky city felt kinship with shepherds on distant hills. National identity was not just born, it was forged, hammered, sharpened. But unity is a blade that cuts both ways. For while nations bound people together, they also drew lines between them. Borders once invisible became wounds in the earth. Differences, once ignored, became fuel for suspicion. Pride swelled, and with pride came rivalry. Each nation sought not just survival, but dominance. The machine was eager to serve. Factories poured out weapons by the thousands. Cannons rolled from assembly lines, rifles stamped in steel. Warships launched by nations who now measured their strength not in land, but in firepower. Progress was no longer a march, was a race, and races, by their nature, demand winners, and losers. Colonies became prizes. Territories were carved like meat at a banquet table. Distant lands consumed by nations hungry for resources to feed their ever-growing machines. Men who had never set foot on these far-off shores suddenly claimed them as their own, planting flags in soils they did not understand. The world was shrinking, and in the shrinking came collisions. Nations jostled like storm clouds, sparks crackling where their borders touched. A dispute over a river, a quarrel over trade, a skirmish at sea. Each spark threatened to ignite a fire too vast to contain, and yet, beneath the rising tension, there was also wonder. Nations built universities that rivaled temples, laboratories that gleamed brighter than palaces. They sent explorers to the poles, scientists into jungles, engineers into the sky itself. Rivalry drove invention, invention drove discovery, and discovery fed pride. Humanity was reaching higher than ever before, while standing ever closer to the edge. The paradox deepened. The same machines that brought light to cities also forged the darkness of arsenals. The same factories that produced medicines produced bullets. The same rails that carried food to starving lands also carried armies to war. It was as though the world had found itself holding to mirrors, one reflecting its noblest dreams, the other its darkest hungers. And both were growing brighter, clearer, unavoidable. The people felt it. Every parade, every anthem, every speech from leaders fed both hope and fear. They cheered the power of their nations. But in the quiet of night, mothers wept, sensing that this pride, this unity, this restless ambition was leading somewhere. Somewhere from which there might be no easy return, because the machine was no longer content with building nations. It was teaching them how to destroy each other. The world had been trembling for years. Borders drawn in haste, promises signed in ink, rivalries sharpened like knives. And then one sparks, small, almost forgettable, at first fell into the dry forest of nations. A gunshot in a distant city. A prince dead. And with him, the fragile balance of the world. It was not just a bullet that killed him. It was pride, alliances, ambition. It was centuries of tension wound, tight, waiting for the smallest tremor. When the shot echoed, it was not only a man who fell, but the dam that had held back the flood. The machine roared to life. Within weeks, armies marched, millions of men leaving their villages and cities, their mothers and wives, believing they would be home by Christmas. They carried flags, sang songs of glory, marched into the jaws of history with dreams of honor. But the machine was not merciful. Railways carried soldiers to the front faster than any war before. Factories poured out shells, bullets, guns, airplanes, fragile, trembling wings of wood and cloth, lifted into skies, now turned into battlefields. The war was not of men alone. It was of machines, devouring everything in their path. And so the world became a graveyard. Fields, once golden with wheat, became seas of mud. Forests turned to splinters beneath shellfire. Rivers ran red. Trenches carved deep into the earth became homes of misery rats. Gas, hunger, fear. The roar of cannons never ceased. Day and night blurred into the endless thunder of war. Millions fought, millions died, and for what? For borders that shifted like sand. For rulers who sat far from the front, drawing lines on maps while boys bled in mud. For pride too heavy to lay down. The war spread like fire across continents. Oceans shook with submarines and battleships. Skies darkened with zeppelins, raining bombs onto cities. Civilians, once distant from battle, now felt the war claw at their doors. No place was safe, no heart untouched. And yet, even in the darkness, there were moments of light. A soldier sharing bread with his enemy on a frozen Christmas night. For one brief evening, remembering that both were human. A nurse tending to the wounded without asking what uniform they wore. A letter carried across continents. Words of love breaking through the roar of guns. But the machine cared nothing for these moments. It ground on, relentless, demanding more men, more metal, more blood. The war that was promised to be short stretched on and on, a shadow across years, consuming everything in its path. Nations cracked beneath the weight. Thrones toppled. Empires collapsed. The old world, the world of kings and crowns, of divine right and unshakable empires, died in the trenches alongside the soldiers who fought for it. And yet, even in ruin, the hunger for victory would not stop. Leaders swore the war would end all wars, that sacrifice would give birth to peace. But peace like smoke, slipped through their fingers, because once the machine had learned to kill on such a scale, it could not forget. The guns fell silent, but the silence was not peace. It was heavy, like the air after a storm, still, suffocating, filled with the smell of smoke and the memory of thunder. The world had survived, but it was not the same world. Villages were empty, families broken, fields unplanted. Empires that had seemed eternal crumbled into dust. Maps were redrawn with trembling hands, borders shifted like shadows, and yet the scars ran deeper than any line on paper. The machine, once hailed as progress, had shown its darker face. It had become not a tool, but a master. Humanity now knew what it was capable of, both in creation and in destruction, and that knowledge could not be forgotten. In cities, crowds gathered not to cheer for kings, but to demand something new, something better. They spoke of peace, of unity, of building a world where war might never return. Yet beneath their hope there was unease, because they also knew what lay hidden in the ashes: ambition, fear, hunger. The same forces that had brought the world to ruin were not gone. They were only waiting. The young who returned from the trenches carried more than scars. They carried questions. What had they fought for? Was it glory or greed, freedom or folly? And if so much had been lost, how could the future be trusted? The old certainties had died. Gods, kings, empires, all had been shaken, and in their place new ideas stirred. Some dreamed of democracy, others of revolution, others of machines that might finally free humanity instead of enslaving it. The world was fragile, yet fertile like soil burned by fire, waiting for new seeds. But what seeds would be planted? In laboratories, scientists bent over experiments that hinted at forces more powerful than any cannon. In universities, thinkers debated visions of societies yet unbuilt. In dark rooms, leaders whispered of vengeance, of unfinished wars, of futures claimed by fire. The shadows of tomorrow stretched long, for humanity had seen what it could unleash, and the temptation to unleash it again hung in the air like lightning before a storm. Yet alongside that shadow was light. The same machines that had torn lives apart also carried medicine across continents. The same science that had built weapons also began to unlock the atom, the star, the code of life itself. It was as if humanity stood before two doors, one leading to a new golden age, the other to an abyss deeper than ever before. And both doors were open. The question was not whether humanity could step through, but which door it would choose. And perhaps that is the story of our species. Never certainty, always choice. Always standing at the edge of tomorrow, with shadows stretching behind us and light flickering ahead. So we return to the beginning, to the child in the cave, staring at the stars, to the hunter striking flint and marveling at fire, to the farmer watching the first seed sprout, to the philosopher asking why, to the dreamer whispering what if. From the first breath of Homo Sapiens to the silence after the cannons, the story has always been the same: a slow evolution, not only of flesh and bone, but of spirit, of thought, of vision. We are not only survivors of time, we are its authors. And so, as the dust of one age settles and the dawn of another begins, the question remains, perhaps the only question that matters: when the shadows of tomorrow arrive, will we be ready to face them?